dominated Israeli politics, and the economy was run on primarily socialist lines. Immigration and the economy. From 1948 to 1951, immigration doubled the Jewish population of Israel and left an indelible imprint on Israeli society. 1920. Overall, 700,000 Jews settled in Israel during this period. 21. Some 300,000 arrived from Asian and North African nations as part of the Jewish exodus from Arab and Muslim countries. 22. Among them, the largest group, over 100,000, was from Iraq. The rest of the immigrants were from Europe, including more than 270,000 from Eastern Europe. 23. Mainly Romania and Poland, over 100,000 each. Nearly all the Jewish immigrants could be described as refugees, but only 136,000 from Central Europe had international certification because they belonged to the 250,000 Jews registered by the Allies as displaced after World War II and living in displaced persons camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. 24. In 1950, the Knesset passed the Law of Return, which granted to all Jews and those of Jewish ancestry, Jewish grandparent, and their spouses, the right to settle in Israel and gain citizenship. That year 50,000 Yemenite Jews, 99%, were secretly flown to Israel. In 1951, Iraqi Jews were granted temporary permission to leave the country, and 120,000, over 90%, opted to move to Israel. Jews also fled from Lebanon, Syria and Egypt. Menachem began addressing a mass demonstration in Tel Aviv against negotiations with Germany in 1952. Between 1948 and 1958, the population of Israel rose from 800,000 to 2 million. During this period, food, clothes and furniture had to be rationed in what became known as the austerity period. Immigrants were mostly refugees without money or possessions, and many were housed in temporary camps known as Marabarot. By 1952, more than 200,000 immigrants were living in tents or prefabricated shacks built by the government. Israel received financial aid from private donations from outside the country, mainly the United States. 25. The pressure on the new state's finances led Ben-Gurion to negotiate a controversial reparations agreement with West Germany. During the Knesset debate, some 5,000 demonstrators gathered and riot police had to cordon the building. 26. In 1952, Israel and West Germany signed an agreement, and over the next 14 years, West Germany paid Israel 3 billion marks, around $714 million according to 1953 to 1955 conversion rates. 27. Their reparations became a decisive part of Israel's income, comprising as high as 87.5% of Israel's income in 1956. 28. In 1950, the Israeli government launched Israel bonds for American and Canadian Jews to buy. In 1951, the final results of the bonds program exceeded $52 million. In 1957, bond sales amounted to 35% of Israel's special development budget. 29. The proceeds from these sources were invested in industrial and agricultural development projects, which allowed Israel to become economically self-sufficient. Among the projects made possible by the aid was the Hadera power plant, the Dead Sea Works, the National Water Carrier, port development in Haifa, Ashdod, and Eilat, desalination plants, and national infrastructure projects. Education and culture. In 1949, education was made free and compulsory for all citizens until the age of 14. The state now funded a party-affiliated Zionist education system and a new body created by the Ha'edi or Gudat Israel Party. A separate body was created to provide education for the remaining Palestinian Arab population. The major political parties now competed for immigrants to join their education systems. The government banned the existing educational bodies from the transit camps and tried to mandate a unitary secular socialist education. 30. Under the control of camp managers who also had to provide work, food and housing for immigrants. There were attempts to force Orthodox Yemenite children to adopt a secular lifestyle, including many instances of Yemenite children having their side curls cut by teachers. The Yemenite children affair led to the first Israeli public inquiry, the Frumkin Inquiry. 31. The collapse of the coalition, and an election in 1951, with little change in the results. In 1953 the party-affiliated education system was scrapped and replaced by a secular state education system and a state-run modern Orthodox system. Argued that Israel were allowed to maintain their existing school system. In the early 1950s, under the administration of Yaakov Dori, who had served as the Israel Defense Forces first chief of staff, the Technion launched a campaign to recruit Jewish and pro-Israel scientists from abroad to establish research laboratories and teaching departments in the natural and exact sciences. 32. The first works of Hebrew literature in Israel were written by immigrant authors rooted in the world and traditions of European Jewry. Joseph Haim Brenner, 1881-1921, and Shmuel Joseph Agnon, 1888-1970, are considered by many to be the fathers of modern Hebrew literature. 33. Native-born writers who published their work in the 1940s and 1950s, often called the War of Independence generation, brought a Zabra mentality and culture to their writing. Esyajar, Moshe Shamir, Hanok Bartov and Benjamin Tammuz vacillated between individualism and commitment to society and state. International relations. In its early years Israel sought to maintain a non-aligned position between the superpowers. But in 1952 an anti-Semitic public trial was staged in Moscow in which a group of Jewish doctors were accused of trying to poison Stalin. The doctors' plot, followed by a similar trial in Czechoslovakia, Slunsky trial. This, and failure of Israel to be included in the Bandung Conference of non-aligned states, effectively ended Israel's pursuit of non-alignment. On the 19th of May 1950, in contravention of international law, Egypt announced that the Suez Canal would be closed to Israeli ships and commerce. In 1952 a military coup in Egypt brought Abdel Nasser to power. The United States pursued close relations with the new Arab states, particularly the Nasser-led Egyptian Free Officers Movement and Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. Israel's solution to diplomatic isolation was to establish good relations with newly independent states in Africa. 34, and with France, which was engaged in the Algerian War. Mid-1950s to early 1960s. Mid-1950s. In the January 1955 elections, Mapai won 40 seats and the Labour Party 10. Moshe Sharett became Prime Minister of Israel at the head of a left-wing coalition. Between 1953 and 1956, there were intermittent clashes along all of Israel's borders as Arab terrorism and breaches of the ceasefire resulting in Israeli counter-raids. Palestinian Fedayeen attacks, often organized and sponsored by the Egyptians, were made from Egyptian-occupied Gaza. Fedayeen attacks led to a growing cycle of violence as Israel launched reprisal attacks against Gaza. 35. In 1954 the Uzi submachine gun first entered use by the Israel Defense Forces. In 1955 the Egyptian government began recruiting former Nazi rocket scientists for a missile program. 36. 37. Sharet's government was brought down by the Lavon Affair, a crude plan to disrupt U.S.-Egyptian relations. involving Israeli agents planting bombs at American sites in Egypt. 38. The plan failed when 11 agents were arrested. Defense Minister Lavon was blamed despite his denial of responsibility. The Lavon affair led to Sheret's resignation and Ben-Gurion returned to the post of Prime Minister. Suez Crisis. In 1955, Egypt concluded a massive arms deal with Czechoslovakia, upsetting the balance of power in the Middle East. 39. In 1956, the increasingly pro-Soviet President Nasser of Egypt announced the nationalization of the French and British-owned Suez Canal, which was Egypt's main source of foreign currency. Egypt also blockaded the Gulf of Aqaba, preventing Israeli access to the Red Sea. Israel made a secret agreement with the French at Sevres to coordinate military operations against Egypt. Britain and France had already begun secret preparations for military action. It has been alleged that the French also agreed to build a nuclear plant for the Israelis. Britain and France arranged for Israel to give them a pretext for seizing the Suez Canal. Israel was to attack Egypt, and Britain and France would then call on both sides to withdraw. When, as expected, the Egyptians refused, Anglo-French forces would invade to take control of the canal. Israeli tank column advancing toward Imaitla Pass during Operation Kadesh. Israeli forces, commanded by General Moshe Dayan, attacked Egypt on the 29th of October, 1956. On the 30th of October, Britain and France made their pre-arranged call for both sides to stop fighting and withdraw from the canal area, and for them to be allowed to take up positions at key points on the canal. Egypt refused, and the Allies commenced airstrikes on the 31st of October aimed at neutralizing the Egyptian Air Force. By the 5th of November, the Israelis had overrun the Sinai. The Anglo-French invasion began that day. There was uproar in the UN, with the US and USSR for once in agreement in denouncing the actions of Israel, Britain, and France. A demand for a ceasefire was reluctantly accepted on 7 November. At Egypt's request, the UN sent an emergency force, UNEF, consisting of 6,000 peacekeeping troops from 10 nations to supervise the ceasefire, the first ever UN peacekeeping operation. From the 15th of November, the UN troops marked out a zone across the Sinai to separate the Israeli and Egyptian forces. Upon receiving US guarantees of Israeli access to the Suez Canal, freedom of access out of the Gulf of Aqaba, and Egyptian action to stop Palestinian raids from Gaza, the Israelis withdrew to the Negev. 40. In practice, the Suez Canal remained closed to Israeli shipping. The conflict marked the end of West European dominance in the Middle East. Nasser emerged as the victor in the conflict, having won the political battle, but the Israeli military learned that it did not need British or French support to conquer Sinai, and that it could conquer the Sinai Peninsula in a few days. The Israeli political leadership learned that Israel had a limited time frame within which to operate militarily, after which international political pressure would restrict Israel's freedom of action. Late 1950s. In 1956, two modern Orthodox and religious Zionist parties, Mizrachi and Ha'apol HaMizrachi, joined to form the National Religious Party. The party was a component of every Israeli coalition until 1992, usually running the Ministry of Education. Mapai was once again victorious in the 1959 elections, increasing its number of seats to 47, Labour had 7. Ben-Gurion remained Prime Minister. In 1959 there were renewed skirmishes along Israel's borders that continued throughout the early 1960s. The Arab League continued to widen its economic boycott, and there was a dispute over water rights in the River Jordan basin. With Soviet backing, the Arab states, particularly Egypt, were continuing to build up the forces. Israel's main military hardware supplier was France. Early 1960s. In 1961, a Iraq no-confidence motion over the resurfaced Lavon affair led to Ben-Gurion's resignation. Ben-Gurion declared that he would only accept office if Lavon was fired from the position of the head of Histadrut, Israel's labor union organization. His demands were accepted and Mapai won the 1961 election, 42 seats, keeping Ben-Gurion as PM, with a slight reduction in its share of the seats. Menachem Begin's Iraq Party and the Liberals came next with 17 seats each. In 1962, the Mossad began assassinating